Well, welcome to our fourth session of the Introduction to the New Testament. I'm glad that you could join us today. If you have been watching along, you know that back in session 3, we started talking about Mark's gospel. We opened up to the first chapter and looked at the very beginning of how Mark introduces Jesus and what Mark says is the main point of Jesus' earthly ministry in terms of what he is announcing, what he's proclaiming, and what he's been sent to do. So at this point, we're about at the 16th verse in chapter 1. And I'd like to just let you know a little bit about what's happening at this point. Number one, Jesus is at the point, at the very beginning of his ministry, where he is going to start calling disciples. So that's what we have in this passage from Mark chapter 1. It says this, starting in verse 16. As Jesus passed along the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And Jesus said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fish for people." And immediately they left their nets and followed him. As he went a little farther, he saw James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, who were in their boat mending their nets. Immediately he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired men and followed him. So right here, you'll notice from our previous discussions about the Gospel of Mark that there are these snapshots, these very quick bites or pieces of the story of Jesus and what he's doing. And Mark often uses the word immediately as a way to move from one snapshot to another. And so you have the calling of some disciples, and immediately they followed him. And then you've got other disciples, and immediately he followed them. I think it might be helpful for us to look at where we are talking about, at least in the idea of Jesus being in the Sea of Galilee. The Sea of Galilee is technically a lake. It's called Lake Gennesaret today. And what happens is that the waters from the mountain range at the northern part of Israel have a lot of rainfall. The water comes in clouds and thunderstorms and rain up above the Mediterranean Sea, and often it rains quite extensively in that mountainous area. And those waters, come down the mountainous regions, or sometimes even become filtered through the bedrock of those mountains. And there is a place near the foot of those mountains in Israel where that water comes rushing and gushing out. There are places where the waters come out, they gush into these creeks that end up forming together into the Jordan River. You may have heard of the Jordan River. It's the place where Jesus was baptized by John. Now, the Jordan River exists there for a little while. That fresh, good, clean water comes into Lake Gennesaret, or the Sea of Galilee. It's a freshwater lake where the disciples had fished before they started following Jesus. In fact, when I visited there in 2013, we found out that there's a lot of tilapia in that lake, in the Sea of Galilee. In fact, they call tilapia in Israel St. Peter's fish. Peter the fisherman became one of the disciples. There's a beautiful point of the Gospel of John where they gather around the Sea of Galilee and they bring in their fish and they have a breakfast on the beach. And I really am excited about talking about that when we get to John's Gospel, because it's connected to what we're talking about. This is an area that is a place for mixing of Jewish cities and Gentile cities. There are these villages right around the sea with Jewish populations. They have synagogues. In fact, we'll find that Jesus teaches at some of these synagogues as recorded in the Gospels. So they have people who are faithful Jewish folks, mostly peasants, mostly people that are craftsmen or farmers or even fishermen. And so here we are seeing Jesus come to some of these fishermen and recruiting them to follow him. Now, after the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River emerges again, and it goes all the way down to the lowest point on earth, and that is the Dead Sea. You may have heard of the Dead Sea because of its high content of minerals and salts, and nothing can live in it. The mud is actually said to be quite medicinal or good for your skin. And I know that some people will go and they'll sunbathe in that area, and then they'll get the mud and they'll put it all over themselves. There are spas and resorts in this area. Some people, even companies, sell the salts and the muds from the Dead Sea here in the United States. So that's what happens. The water does not flow out of the Dead Sea. It goes there, it is stagnant, it evaporates from the excess heat from that sort of desert region that the Dead Sea is around. So all those fresh waters will come through, fill that lake, that Sea of Galilee. They go down the Jordan, which is now used primarily not only to feed the Dead Sea, but also to feed to some of the farmland that is in Israel, and to provide water for the city of Jerusalem and other surrounding cities there. So that's the scene where Jesus is. He's at the Sea of Galilee, this lake, and he is calling out for fishermen. So I just want to make sure that we understand this sea is not something that we might imagine of a salt-laden sea. This is a freshwater lake where people make their living. In Mark chapter 1, verse 21, we start to see the process of Jesus meeting people who have desperate need of help. These healings begin where Jesus sees someone who is ill or sick or even possessed by a demonic spirit, and Jesus helps. So in Mark chapter 1, verse 21, there's a man with an unclean spirit. That means that there is a supernatural spirit, some sort of being inside of him. And remember, I want you to think back to one of our first videos when we talked about 4 different ways in which religions at the time were seen as being legitimate, whether it is speaking in tongues or it is in the growth of the religion in terms of people that were worshipers for it. And one of the things we talked about was healings, miraculous events, prove that something supernatural, something divine is happening. So Jesus has quite a few healings, not only throughout the Gospel of Mark, but even here at the very beginning, we start to see left and right, Jesus is healing person after person. Mark, it's important to understand, never seems to say that Jesus was sort of given this authority. And it's as though it was natural to who he is. At no point did God say, I'm giving you now my power to heal people, my power to do these things. No, what ends up happening is that Jesus, as who he is, goes around and begins healing people. He sees them, he is moved in his heart, in his mind, in his soul, in his spirit, whatever it is, to make that difference. And so, in a way, his power to heal is tied into his identity as the Son of God and as the Messiah of Israel. But, sometimes we might hear people say, well, these were all healings just to prove how holy he was or how powerful he was. But we also have to think about what's actually happening in the healings. These are often people who are gravely ill. These are often people who are having great difficulties. They are facing very difficult scenarios or situations in their life. And in that sense, there is pain. There is difficulty in their lives. And Jesus is actually, by healing them, restoring them to the life that they should have or could have had. In a way, what Jesus is doing is acting with love and mercy. So the miracles are not just a sign of the glory of God incarnate into this Son of Man, but it's also a sign that Jesus is God in flesh in front of us. If God cares about people who are hurting or sick, who are the outcasts, then we should as well. And thanks be to God that Jesus does this. God is a loving God, a God of steadfast love and forgiveness, as we hear over and over in the Old Testament. Jesus in his healings mirrors this. Remember that we talked about, I think in the very first video, Deuteronomic theology. That is the sort of early Old Testament understanding that when God loves you, good things happen to you. When God hates you, bad things happen to you. When you are good, when you honor God, when you worship God, when you're a good person, good things happen to you. When you're a bad person, when you sin, when you do terrible things, bad things happen to you. In a way, this is also tied up in the healings that Jesus performs in the Gospels, including here in Matthew. In Mark. So in the Gospel of Mark, we've got people who are unclean. They have these spirits that have taken over, these demonic possessions. We've got people who are ill, who are lepers. We've got people that are really in terrible position. And again, connected to the idea of love and mercy. Other people would ignore them. Other people would say they brought it on themselves, that they or someone else in their family sinned, and this is the consequence, this is the result. Jesus doesn't do that. In a reversal of that Deuteronomic theology, he has compassion for people and heals them and restores them to the life they could or should have had. So, love and mercy are an important part of the healings. Let's not forget that. Now, they also become vehicles, healings that is, for Jesus to teach. And you'll find that in the Gospel of Matthew. I'm not going to go over every verse or every chapter in the Gospel of Mark, because this is an introduction to the New Testament. But if you were to take time and read through this, one of the shortest Gospels, it probably is an easy one to do. What you'll find is that often the healings of Jesus are used by Mark or other Gospel writers to then push us to understand some new teaching or some way in which Jesus is revealing something about either himself or about God. So healings are not just stories to gloss over and say, wow, look at this, Jesus is really great. They're often important things either on the surface, beneath the surface, or even in a teaching that is either before or after the healing that helps us understand that better. Now, one of the things that we come to in Mark chapter 1, verse 34, is an odd occurrence when Jesus is healing someone with this unclean spirit. So I'm going to go back to verse 32 in Mark chapter 1. And this is the evening, this is a time in which they were having all these people brought to them, to Jesus for healing or help. It says this, "That evening at sundown, they brought to him all who were sick or possessed with demons, and the whole city was gathered around the door. And he cured many who were sick with various diseases and cast out many demons, and he would not permit the demons to speak because they knew him." So that's verse 34 where we ended, and that's an important thing that first appears in the Gospel of Mark right there. It's almost a toss-away sentence, isn't it? Jesus is healing these people, he's taking care of these people, he's casting out demons, but he would not let the demons speak because they knew him. What does that mean? You know, when we think about the Son of God, it might seem weird for the Son of God, the Messiah, to know demons, for demons to know him, for him to know them, right? It might seem like they're in cahoots in some way. In fact, sometimes the religious leaders of Israel will often throw out accusations at Jesus that he must be, if he's doing all these things and he's not a holy man, he must be in league with demons or evil. The sign that Jesus is known by the demons has nothing to do with any kind of interaction with them. In fact, these demonic spirits are supernatural. They're not of this world, right? And so they would be, as not of this world, more aware of who God is and who God's presence is placed upon. And so in this sense, what is going on is that the demons know who he is, and they're terrified of him. We'll see that in other healings. The demons don't want to be around God because God is in the business of thwarting their plans. So when Jesus tells them not to speak, part of what is going on is something called the Messianic secret. They know who Jesus is. He's not ready for other people to know who he is yet. The Gospel of Mark is very unique in this. Whereas other Gospels, Jesus is somewhat more free in his identity as the Son of God and the Messiah. More so as you go through the Gospels, The Gospel of Mark seems to almost consistently all the way through, at least in the first half of his Gospel, not have a situation where Jesus is saying, yeah, go tell people who I am. No. In fact, he tells people, keep this to yourself. Don't spread the news. It's just between you and me, in a sense. And what scholars are saying is that Mark has this sort of theme going on, that if too many people were aware of who Jesus really was, it would thwart God's plans or what Jesus has in store. In fact, most of the time when Jesus says, I'm not ready for this yet, it's because the Gospels tell us his hour has not yet come. And what his hour is what we mentioned earlier in, I think, the second video, the Passion narrative. That is the understanding of Jesus' arrest, trial, death upon the cross, and burial. The Passion of Jesus. That's the time where people can start to be aware of who he truly is. Some of the disciples in other Gospels find that out sooner. But in Mark's Gospel, it's really something that he wants to keep quiet. So if you ever heard of a messianic secret, that's usually referring to what's going on in the Gospel of Mark. Now, Mark has already told us, the reader, right, that Jesus is the Son of God in the very first verse. So Mark is not trying to hide the identity, but Jesus is doing that because if you think about it in that contemporary sense where Jesus is living, breathing, teaching and everything, and if his hour has not yet come, and there is a fear that exposing his true identity would alter those plans, it makes sense to keep it a secret. That is an idea, a hypothesis, a theory, but it definitely is something that you encounter in the Gospel of Mark. If you were to read just the first 4 chapters of Mark's Gospel, you will encounter a lot of interesting teachings, healings, and parables. There's a lot of Jesus teaching in parables in the Gospel of Mark. And parables are a way that Jesus teaches using a story. Often he doesn't explain what he's trying to get across, but sometimes he will, especially to the disciples. And in fact, what we find is that in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus even tells the disciples, you understand the kingdom of heaven. You understand the truth. I'm teaching in parables to everybody else. Why? Scholars think that messianic secret thing is still part of that Jesus teaches in parables so that he can teach a timeless, important teaching, but still keep a little bit of his identity veiled. Now, some people think that parables are unique to Jesus. They're wrong. Parables exist even in the Old Testament. In fact, there are 3 that we know of in the book of Ezekiel. And there are other teachers that we believe had been using parables as a way of educating the public. Parables typically are structured in such a way where there are everyday characters and everyday situations. And through that story, people could identify with various characters. They understood who they were. They didn't have to think about anything really complex to put themselves in those people's shoes. It was everyday. It was something that was super familiar to everyone. And so Jesus uses these as vehicles to teach something important about the kingdom of God, about how heaven works, about how God's love or grace works. Think about some of the most famous of the parables. The lost coin, the lost sheep. People could understand very easily what it was like to be a shepherd who loses one sheep, right? Or the parable of the lost coin, the person who loses the coin and they search all over the house. We've lost money before. We know what that is like. These are everyday situations, and then Jesus connects those to some deeper teaching. Jesus teaches in parables, and they often have layers of understanding. In fact, I've actually talked to people who've read parables over the course of 4 decades, and along the way, they learn different things about God or about the parable as they grow. They see it with different perspectives. Think about the prodigal son. When someone's younger, maybe they identify a little bit more with the prodigal son. As they get older, maybe they have siblings that have gotten into a little bit of trouble, and they start identifying with the older brother, or maybe as a parent They know what it's like for their heart to break for a child making all the wrong decisions. And what do? Their heart breaks, and they know what it's like to be a loving father who loves unconditionally and is ready to forgive. So along the way, parables are signs and teachings that really require a couple of passes. There needs to be several readings, not just even at one sitting, over the course of many years to really appreciate them for their whole potential. At the end of the 4th chapter of Mark, we come to another miracle of note. Now, to this point, most of the miracles have been about Jesus healing people. The miracle of Mark chapter 4 happens to do with Jesus commanding the waters and the winds and the storms. So Mark chapter 4, at the very end, is a section really devoted to these early days and early teachings of Jesus. And in this time, Jesus has covered a lot of ground and has really done a lot in terms of bringing restoration and healing to people. However, in Mark chapter 4, things start to change just a little bit. And at these healings, he actually is moving towards the point at which his identity is becoming a little bit more well known. So at the end of chapter 4, we have Jesus calming a storm. And so I'd like to read this passage to you. It starts with verse 35. On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, "Let's go across to the other side of the sea," which again is a lake. And leaving the crowd behind, they took with him the boat, just as he was. Other boats were with him. A great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat so that the boat was already being swamped. But he was in the stern, asleep on a cushion. And they woke him up and said, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" He woke up and rebuked the wind, and he said to the sea, "Peace, be still." Then the wind ceased, and there was dead calm. He said to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great awe and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" So I think it's really important as we finish up today's 4th session on the Introduction to the New Testament that we talk a little bit about this healing, this miracle. This miracle here in the 4th chapter goes beyond Jesus interacting with other human beings, and he begins to control creation. This miracle is a step up in a sense. I want you to put your mind into the place of a 1st century Jewish person who believes that nature is chaotic and uncontrollable, unpredictable. There is no weather channel. There is no app on your phone letting you know that there is a tornado coming. You are simply hit with the information of what is happening as a storm arrives. So you have this unpredictable, uncontrollable power in nature. And then you have a human being that eats, that sleeps, that has done some healing, that has healed people, who can do some amazing things, but then controls the world. No one else can control the world except for God. According to this 1st century Jewish person, it is God who created the world with his voice. God didn't fashion creation with his hands. God spoke and there was light. God spoke and he divided the water from the land. God's voice is productive. It reigns in the chaos of creation and orders it. So you have now a human being who has, with his voice, done some amazing things. For instance, be made clean. It's with Jesus' voice that he controls someone and heals them. Your sins are forgiven by his voice. he actually forgives the sins of someone. And then peace, be still to the sea. He controls the sea with his voice. Jesus here is showing signs of his divine power and identity. Not only is he a Messiah who can heal, he apparently is God's Son who can control creation and speak order into the chaos of our lives. This is an example of a great leap in theology, because at this point, it was ludicrous for someone to even believe that a human being could be divine. Sure, there were other religions who did that. In fact, the Roman Empire eventually, in its relationship with Judaism, would do this because one of the emperors believed that he was the Son of God, that he was divine after his father. And they even had a Roman imperial cult where they worshipped the emperors and the living emperor at that time. So they understood it, but Jewish people, they could not even imagine that. They were monotheistic. There's one God, and that God is the God who created everything and spoke it into existence. A human being cannot have that identity or that power. This is a leap for these first century Jewish people who are now believing, as Jesus is doing something miraculous like this, that there is something new happening. There's something brand new happening. And Jesus is displaying that identity as being something more than human right before their very eyes. Mark wants us to understand that this is a turning point. Mark chapter 4, very end, calming of the storm. This is a turning point. A little bit more about that messianic secret is being revealed. They're starting to understand, who is this that can do these things? I hope you've enjoyed this second Bible study in the Gospel of Mark, our fourth session overall. And we're going to continue diving deeper into this first section of Mark about the life and teachings of Jesus before we eventually get to the second half of the book, which will be about the passion of Jesus. Hope you have a good evening and week, and we'll see you next week.